The topic is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and we're talking to Professor Baldwin from Vanderbilt University dealing with this very, very important act. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, before we had our first commercial break, we promised that we'd give you an opportunity to further expand upon the Act of 1964. And I think one of the most important developments in reference to that has to do with the so-called political climate.
That's
and,
right.
If you could sort of put that in some kind of perspective for us.
Yeah, I think we have to first understand that there was a direct connection between civil rights protests of the 60s and the effort to pass a civil rights bill. Many scholars argue that Dr. King and SCLC's demonstrations that were led in the early 60s sort of helped create the political climate for the Civil Rights Act. But I think Roy Wilkins of the NAACP put it best when he said that if you're going to understand how this political climate was created, you have to go beyond SCLC and Dr. King to look at the sit-ins, the freedom rides in 1960-61, to look at the swim-ins that were occurring in St. Augustine, Florida, to look at some of the other civil rights protests across the South, that all of this sort of created the impetus for the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
You know, when you talk about the freedom rides, Dr. Baldwin, many young people might not understand exactly what these rides were all about. But I think more important, they might not understand the sort of courage that it took to become involved in what is known as the Freedom Ride. Talk about it from that perspective.
Well, the Freedom Rides occurred in the period 1960 up to 1961. It involved students boarding buses in Washington, D.C., black and white, black students sitting at the front, white students sitting at the back of the bus, rather. And they would ride from Washington, D.C. to various points in the South to protest bus segregation and segregation in interstate travel. So you're quite right in saying that it took a lot of courage for students to move into parts of the South on buses, black students sitting at the front, white students at the back of the bus, protesting segregation. Many students were brutalized, beaten. But I think we have to see the sit-ins, of course, as having contributed immensely to the kind of political climate that made possible the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
You know, I think somebody once remarked that in reality, all of the sit-ins were done, and as a matter of fact, I think you might have made this comment, that in a real sense it was the students who sort of guided that civil rights movement in a real sense through the sit-ins and et cetera.
And the Freedom Rides.
And Freedom Rides.
Yes,
Speak to it.
Very much so. I think that's one of the problems in scholarship on the historiography of the civil rights movement is that the roles of students have been pretty much ignored by scholars. David Halberstam has dealt with it in a book called The Children, and of course John Lewis wrote a book called Walking with the Wind, and they take into account the roles of students. But that part has been ignored. Largely, the focus has been on Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the role of clergy and the churches in the movement. And undoubtedly, churches, clergymen, leaders like King did a lot in terms of helping create that climate. But I think we need to take into account also the courage and the contributions and the commitment of students.
And these students were really on the front line. They were in reality were the troops of, in a real sense, the civil rights movement.
And unsung heroes in many ways.
Well, you know, Dr. Baldwin, when you look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, what could you say in reference to pulling all of this together? That is, all of the activity that has gone on dealing with civil rights and et cetera, and yet still, even today, we find that there are still some questions in reference to non-discrimination and those things.
Exactly. I think it speaks to the fact that the hopes and dreams and expectations that people had